right, welcome to day 10. After today's lesson, we'll be halfway through. And what we wanted to look at today was the squares that are covered by the bishops once they reach their natural developing squares. So today we're going to look at white's natural developing squares for the bishops and what squares are controlled by those bishops. So first we're going to look at the queenside bishop, the dark squared bishop, which is normally on C1. And let's just look at the squares it covers from each of its natural developing squares, which would be D2, E3, F4, and G5. So let's look at D2 first, and let's just look at the squares that it covers. It covers the E1 to A5 diagonal, and it covers the C1 to H6 diagonal. And if we wanted to, we could just look at these diagonals in relation to the long diagonals and tie it together with what we looked at during our last session. And that is that this E1 to A5 diagonal is, let's see, 1, 2, 3 diagonals away from the long light squared diagonal, which it parallels. And so it is on opposite colors. So it's a dark squared diagonal versus a light squared diagonal. And it is 3 squares away from the corners of that long diagonal. So 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And the other thing to notice is if we look at the other diagonal, if we look at the C1 to H6 diagonal and compare it to the long dark squared diagonal, which it parallels, the A1 to H8 diagonal, it is 2 diagonals away. So 1, 2. And so since it's an even number, it's on the same colored square. So it's also a dark squared diagonal. And it's 2 squares away. Where it runs the edge of the board, where the diagonal ends, is 2 squares away from the corners of that long diagonal. Now, we're not going to do that for everything, but I just wanted to point that out and kind of tie that in to our last session. But let's just look at the squares it covers from each natural developing square. So from E3, it still covers the C1 to H6 diagonal. And now it covers the G1 to A7 diagonal. From F5, it now covers the H2 to B8 diagonal, in addition to still covering the C1 to H6 diagonal. And finally, on G5, it now covers the H4 to D8 diagonal and still covers the C1 to H6 diagonal. So we just looked at the 4 natural developing squares for the C1 bishop. Now let's just move it over to F1, the light squared bishop or kingside bishop for white. And let's look at the same thing. Its natural developing square of E2 covers the D1 to H5 diagonal and the F1 to A6 diagonal. Moving it to D3, it now covers the B1 to H7 diagonal and continues to cover the F1 to A6 diagonal. Taking it to C4, we now cover the A2 to G8 diagonal and the F1 to B6 diagonal, of course, is still covered. And finally, for B5, we covered the A1 to E8 diagonal and continue to cover the F1 to A6 diagonal. And so now for the exercise for today, is to just get your pencil and paper, close out the chessboard, and without looking at the chessboard, write down the squares, the natural developing squares for both of white's bishops, so the bishop on c1 and the bishop on f1. And just like we did there, write down the squares that these bishops can cover from each of their natural developing squares. So the bishop on c1, you would want to see what squares it covers on d2, from its position on d2, all the squares it covers, and continue to do that for its 4 natural developing squares, as well as the 4 natural developing squares for the bishop on f1, and write down each square it covers from each of those natural developing squares. And it's going to start to get more difficult, so do not get frustrated if this is a struggle. It's important to just kind of push our brains hard, and just keep focusing on this, and we'll keep moving forward. Good luck. See you next time.